Oscar Wilde. A name that, when we hear it, immediately makes us expect that what will be quoted from him will surprise and delight us. Yet the history of literature can show few examples of so much glory joined to so much humiliation. For a time, his fame might have been mistaken for notoriety. But now his reputation as a dramatist is secure. His brilliance as a critic is acknowledged, and his fictions continue to reverberate.
The gods had given me almost everything. I had genius, a distinguished name, high social position, brilliancy, intellectual daring. I made art a philosophy, and philosophy an art. I altered the minds of men and the colors of things. There was nothing I said or did that did not make people wonder. I awoke the imagination of my century so that it created myth and legend around me. I became the spendthrift of my own genius, and to waste an eternal youth gave me a curious joy.
The family into which Wilde was born was one of the most distinguished in Ireland during the 19th century. His father, Sir William Wilde, was an eminent surgeon and founded the first hospital for the treatment of the eye and ear. This is St. Mark's Hospital, which continues to this day. His interests extended beyond medicine. As an archaeologist, he discovered a prehistoric Irish lake dwelling, and he compiled a catalogue of antiquities which is still in use in the National Museum of Ireland. Sir William Wilde wrote several books about places, the most ingratiating being one on Lough Corrib in the west of Ireland and another on the River Boyne in the east. A private and possibly less creditable accomplishment was that, before his marriage, Sir William had begotten 3 illegitimate children. Their mother, or mothers, are unknown. This fact may account for the foundlings and mysteries of birth in Oscar Wilde's works. Sir William was also involved in a post-marital scandal. A woman patient claimed that, during a fainting spell, she had been seduced by him in his office. A sceptical jury awarded her only a farthing damages for her outraged virtue, and Sir William's friends stood by him. The allegation of sexual misconduct anticipated other charges levelled 30 years later against his son, Oscar.
I want to introduce you to my mother. We have founded a society for the suppression of virtue.
If Sir William was unusual, Lady Wilde was even more so. As a young woman, she won renown for patriotic poems which, under the pseudonym of Speranza, she contributed to the nationalist journal The Nation. What remained of her revolutionary fervour in later years was a readiness to pronounce iconoclastically on all subjects. Asked to receive at one of her weekly receptions a woman who was identified as respectable, Lady Wilde responded,
"You must never employ that description in this house. It is only tradespeople who are respectable."
Her not too respectable son, Oscar Wilde, was born at 21 Westland Row, Dublin, on the 16th of October, 1854. He always said that he'd been born at 1 Merrion Square, the grander address to which his family moved a year later. And he was accustomed to date his birth 2 years after it actually occurred. This was a modest recalculation compared to his mother's, for she always claimed to be 5 years younger than she actually was. The Wilde parents maintained their large house in Dublin with a German governess, a French maid, and 6 servants. The children received their early education at home. Their summers they spent away from Dublin in the west of Ireland.
We are at the top of Loch Corrib, which, if you refer to your geography, you will find to be a lake, 30 miles long, 10 broad, and situated in the most romantic scenery in Ireland.
There, on the shores of Loch Corrib, Sir William Wilde had built Moytura House, supposedly where the prehistoric battle of Moytura took place. The family also owned a hunting lodge, Elon Row, on what Oscar Wilde called a little purple island, in the middle of nearby Loch Fee. The children accompanied their father as he searched for ruins of antiquity. They also learned to ride, hunt, and fish. In later life, Wilde preferred to leave this early athleticism unsuspected.
I'm afraid I play no outdoor games at all, except dominoes. I have sometimes played dominoes outside French cafes.
At the age of 9, Wilde was sent to Portora Royal School in Enniskillen and remained there for 7 years. The first letter from his hand that survives was written to his mother from school. In it, he asks for his 2 flannel shirts, 1 crimson and 1 lilac. At the age of 13, he was already a dandy. Portora gave Wilde a good grounding in the classics, and like most Protestant boys, he went on to study at Trinity College, Dublin. By now, his tastes were becoming rarefied. In his rooms in Botany Bay, as the building he lived in at Trinity was called, he had an easel with a half-finished painting on it. In art, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Pre-Raphaelites, and in literature, of Swinburne. He continued his classical studies with his tutor, Professor J.P. Mahaffey, whose witty conversation encouraged his own ability in this direction. After 2 years at Trinity, Wilde aspired to display his talents in a larger arena. He took an examination for a demyship, or scholarship, at Magdalen College, Oxford, and won it. Professor Mahaffey said wryly,
"You are not quite good enough for us here, Oscar. Better run up to Oxford."
Wilde did so on October 1874, a few days before he turned 20.
The 2 great turning points of my life were when my father sent me to Oxford and when society sent me to prison.
To a young Irishman, Oxford was to the mind what Paris was to the body. Wilde felt he must measure himself against its alien standards. His ambitions were unbounded.
God knows, I won't be a dried-up Oxford Don anyhow. I'll be a poet, a writer, a dramatist. Somehow or other, I'll be famous. And if not famous, I'll be notorious.
The 2 Oxford worthies whom he most wanted to meet were John Ruskin and Walter Pater, both famous for their art criticism. The opportunity to meet Ruskin came quickly. for Ruskin mobilised some of his students to help him build a beautiful country road where there was then only a swampy rut in North Hinksey. Wilde at once volunteered. He said later that he was accorded the privilege of using Ruskin's own especial wheelbarrow, and that the master himself had initiated him into the mysteries of wheeling this object from place to place. Something like a road was built. It soon sank from sight, however. But for Wilde, it served as the road to Ruskin, with whom he became friends, and it prompted him to look for other ways of infusing beauty into ordinary life. The other person he wanted to meet, Walter Pater, he did not encounter personally until later in his university course. But in Pater's writings he found another point of view. Where Ruskin exalted art for its ethical power to improve society, Pater exalted it for the intense and glowing moments it enabled the individual to feel. Wilde, instead of choosing between them, chose both.
I want to eat of the fruit of all the trees in the garden of the world. The best way to resist temptation is to yield to it.
Come into the garden, Maud, for the blackbird night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate alone. And the woodbine spices are wafted abroad, and the musk of the roses blown.
Wilde soon became known at Oxford for his outlandish aesthetic tastes and for the epigrams with which he publicised them. His most famous remark in undergraduate days was,
I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china.
A sermon was preached against this in the university church. He followed the same ambiguous course with religion. During his first year at Oxford, he became a Freemason, but at the same time he was greatly drawn to becoming a Catholic, though Freemasonry was prescribed by the church.
If I could hope that the church would wake in me some earnestness and purity, I would go over as a luxury, if for no better reasons. But I can hardly hope it would, and to go over to Rome would be to sacrifice and give up my two great gods, money and ambition. Still, I get so wretched and low and troubled that in some desperate mood I will seek the shelter of a church which simply enthralls me by its fascination.
One of his Oxford friends, who was ardently Catholic, urged Wilde to come to Rome to meet Pope Pius IX. Wilde came and was moved not to bend the knee, but to write a sonnet. He blamed this hesitation about conversion on his father's objections. When, in 1876, his father died, he still held off. Some time later, when Arthur Balfour asked Wilde what his religion was, he replied,
I don't think I have any. I am an Irish Protestant.
His social activities did not prevent Wilde from secretly studying for his Oxford examinations. To everyone's surprise, he achieved a double first in the classical course, and he also won the Newdigate Prize for a poem on the fallen splendour of Ravenna.
The Dons are astonished beyond words. The bad boy doing so well in the end.
Wilde, like some conqueror from the remote provinces, moved on to London with every intention of subjugating it, or at least beguiling it.
To get into the best society nowadays, one either has to feed people, amuse people, or shock people. That is all.
While still a student, Wilde had made forays into London. He knew the painters, especially Burne-Jones and Whistler. He knew the theatrical figures, Henry Irving and Ellen Terry, and even Sarah Bernhardt. And he took a great interest also in the PBs, professional beauties.
No man has any real success in this world unless he has got women to back him, and women rule society.
His favourite among the PBs was Lily Langtry. He helped persuade her to take up acting as a career. When asked in the United States later if he had discovered her, he replied,
I would rather have discovered Lily Langtry than have discovered America.
Occasionally, Wilde still returned to Ullin Row in the west of Ireland. Once he brought with him an artist friend, Frank Miles. While they were there, Wilde enthusiastically wrote to a friend in London.
I have only got one salmon as yet, but have had heaps of sea trout which give great play. I have not had a blank day yet. Grouse are few, but I have got a lot of hares, so I've had a capital time of it. I am sure you would like this wild mountainous country, close to the Atlantic, and teeming with sport of all kinds. It is in every way magnificent, and makes me years younger than actual history records.
Frank Miles memorialized their visit by painting portraits of himself and Wilde in the form of two cherubs with fishing rods. These still survive in the hall of Ullin Row. But Wilde's writings of this period were not cherubic. He was putting together a volume of poems, some of them shocking by the standards of the day. They were published in 1881. Wilde only commented,
There is only one thing worse than being talked about, and that is not talked about.
It was Wilde's personality, rather than his poetry, which overwhelmed London society. Soon, no dinner party, theatrical first night, or gallery opening was complete without him.
I should never have believed, had I not experienced it, how easy it is to become the most prominent figure in society.
The Prince of Wales asked to meet him and said,
I do not know Mr. Wilde, and not to know Mr. Wilde is not to know anybody.
This was the period when Wilde was reputed to have walked down Piccadilly wearing a sunflower or carrying a lily. But when questioned about it, he said,
Anyone could have done that. The difficult thing was to make people think I had done it.
He became the subject of caricature in Punch, and was also taken off in two successful burlesque comedies.
If you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line as a man of culture rare, you must get up all the germs of the transcendental terms and plant them everywhere. You must lie upon the daisies and discourse in novel phrases of your complicated state of mind. The meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of a transcendental kind. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a very singularly deep young man this deep young man must be.
Nothing succeeds like excess. Give me the luxuries, and I can dispense with the necessities.
Wilde's habitual extravagance enabled him to run quickly through a small inheritance from his father. How the Oscar Wilde argosy could be floated now became a problem. Fortunately, at this juncture, the great theatrical impresario Richard D'Oyly Carte needed his services. Carte was trying to pave the way in America for Gilbert and Sullivan's new opera, Patience. He feared that the audience there would not understand the parody of the aesthetic young man in Bunthorne and Grosvenor. Sending an aesthete on a lecture tour in the United States might help.
In the high aesthetic band, if you walk down Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in your medieval hand.
No aesthete was better known than Oscar Wilde, so D'Oyly Carte invited him.
If he's content.
Wilde accepted the invitation and entered into its spirit by donning knee breeches and other spectacular articles of attire, as if these were his habitual wear. The velveteen breeches and silk stockings enabled him to show off his good legs. Wilde, however, had no intention of serving merely as a figure of fun. He wanted to introduce his theories of art and beauty to the multitude, and to meet the social and literary elite. Wilde arrived on the 2nd of January 1882 on the SS Arizona. Reporters swarmed round him on the ship. They had expected someone slender and effete, and were surprised to encounter instead a man 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with an extraordinary readiness of speech and wit. To the customs officer who asked him if he had anything to declare, he replied,
I have nothing to declare except my genius.
To some extent, his knee breeches and his repetition of the word beauty excited derision. But the 135 audiences he addressed in the course of a year found unexpected sense in what he had to say. When journalists belittled him, he retaliated with vigour.
In old days, men had the rack. Now they have the press. The Oscar of the first period is dead. We are now concerned with the Oscar of the second period, who has nothing whatever in common with the gentleman who wore long hair and carried a sunflower down Piccadilly.
On his return from America, Wilde went to Paris for a few months to write a play which had been commissioned by the well-known American actress Mary Anderson. In Paris, the apostle of the English Renaissance found himself in the midst of the French decadence, as the literary movement there was called. Wilde adapted himself to this vogue and had his hair curled in the manner of the decadent emperor Nero. He stayed at the Hotel Voltaire on the Quai Voltaire, his rooms being on the 2nd floor. A visitor remarked on the lovely view of the Louvre over the River Seine.
Oh, that is altogether immaterial, except to the proprietor, who of course charges it on the bill. A gentleman never looks out of the window.
Wilde was well received by Victor Hugo and other writers. At a dinner party, Émile Zola toasted him, then said,
Unfortunately, Mr. Wilde will have to respond in his barbarous tongue.
Wilde replied in his almost faultless French,
I am Irish by birth, English by race, and as Monsieur Zola says, condemned to speak the language of Shakespeare.
His visit to France ended with Mary Anderson refusing his play, a rebuff that did not shake his confidence that he would yet conquer the world with his art, as he had done already with his personality.
Prepare yourself for an astonishing piece of news. I am engaged to Oscar Wilde and am perfectly and insanely happy.
In May 1881, Oscar Wilde had met at a party a woman named Constance Lloyd, whose brother he had known at Oxford. pretty and intelligent, Constance took his fancy as he took hers. His lecture tour to America interrupted their meetings. Then, in the autumn of 1883, they met several times. In November, Wilde was staying at the Shelbourne Hotel while lecturing at the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin. Constance Lloyd was visiting her grandmother in nearby Ely Place. Wilde proposed to her and was at once accepted. On the 29th of May, 1884, the young couple were married in St. James's Church in Paddington. Whistler's telegram, "Fear I may not be able to arrive in time for the ceremony, don't wait," added to the ebullience of the occasion. Their wedding trip took them to Paris. Wilde announced that he intended to set an example of the influence of art on matrimony. Whatever he meant by this, he was for the time as happy as was Constance. They walked daily in the Tuileries Gardens and went to see an exhibition of Whistler's paintings. They attended an opera and also a performance by Wilde's old friend Sarah Bernhardt as Lady Macbeth. By coincidence, the honeymoon took place at the time that a new book, destined to have a great effect on Wilde, was published in Paris. This was A Rebours, Against the Grain, by J.K. Huysmans. It was the breviary of French decadence. Wilde would say later that it was badly written, but had given him an idea. The idea was the Picture of Dorian Gray. Back in London, the Wildes settled in a house in Tite Street, Chelsea, which William Godwin remodelled for them. Husband and wife were much in demand. Constance, during the first 2 years of her marriage, had 2 pregnancies. The first child was Cyril, born in 1885, and the second, Vivian, born in 1886. Wilde was pleased with his offspring, possibly less pleased, as time went on, with his wife. They lived expensively, chiefly on Constance's money, though there was not enough of this to pay their bills on time.
I want to talk to you about your taxes.
What taxes? What makes you think I should pay taxes?
Well, sir, you live in this house. You sleep here.
Ah, yes. But then, you see, I sleep so badly.
The year 1886 was important for another reason than the birth of his second son. Wilde was perhaps the last person to discover that he was homosexual. Others had been suspecting it for some time. A young man named Robert Ross, then only 17 but thoroughly experienced, seems to have persuaded him. This change of sexual direction was pivotal for Wilde's writing as well as for his life. He had often talked, half-seriously, about the virtue of wearing a mask or of assuming a pose, and had often acknowledged his contradictory impulses. Now he found himself leading a double life. Responsible husband and father, he was also a profligate boy-chaser. This ambiguity must be credited with inspiring most of his subsequent works, in which heroes and heroines alike discover or disclose that they are not what they seem. Dorian Gray ruins the lives of men as well as of women indiscriminately. Wilde's wit became more piercing as he made others also see beneath the surface of casual converse while keeping its structures intact. In his early 30s, his views of homosexuality, epigrams, and artistic insight began to coalesce into a working method from which his best writings would come. This change occurred gradually. In 1885, he gave up lecturing for reviewing books. Then, in 1887 and 1888, he became editor of a magazine, The Woman's World. But he tired of it, and began to write down some of the stories he had been thinking up and retailing orally to his friends. The Picture of Dorian Gray was the most important of these. Up to then, he said later, he had kept to the sun-gilt side of the garden of life.
The other half of the garden had its secrets for me also.
And these he would now have to unravel. In June of 1891, when Wilde was at the height of his powers, the poet Lionel Johnson came to visit him. He brought along his young cousin, Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie. A Magdalen College student, like Wilde before him, Douglas was one of 4 children of the Marquis of Queensberry. Before meeting Wilde, he had read Dorian Gray over and over. It had become his sacred book. Wilde gave the extraordinarily handsome young lord a special copy of the first edition.
He is quite like a Narcissus, so white and gold.
For his part, Douglas felt the fascination of Wilde. He contrived another meeting some months later, when he was being blackmailed by a homosexual partner. He besought Wilde's help. Wilde, always generous, went up to Oxford for a weekend. The blackmail problem he solved by arranging for a London solicitor to pay off the blackmailer. He and Douglas also began their love affair, which must rank as one of the great love affairs of the Victorian age. It pitted Wilde against Victorianism. Unfortunately, Victorianism was ready to pounce. For 4 splendid years, from 1891 to 1895, Oscar Wilde dominated the Victorian scene. In 1892, he had his first great theatrical success with Lady Windermere's Fan. People came to scoff and remained to cheer. When applause brought him onto the stage, Wilde appeared smoking a cigarette, something not done in those days, and gave a most unusual curtain speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have enjoyed this evening immensely. The actors have given us a charming rendering of a delightful play, and your appreciation has been most intelligent. I congratulate you on the great success of your performance, which persuades me that you think almost as highly of the play as I do myself.
The previous autumn, Wilde had enjoyed a great triumph in Paris. During a visit, he had an unprecedented vogue in that city. Old writers and new sought his acquaintance. In this euphoric mood, he seized upon the idea of competing with the French on their own ground by writing a play in their language. The result was Salome, much of it composed in the Grand Café in the Boulevard des Capucines. The tetrarch Herod longs for Salome's body, and Salome longs for John the Baptist's bodiless head. When she gets it, she kisses it. Herod, as contradictory in his impulses as Wilde, passes from lust to spiritual revulsion and has her killed. Sarah Bernhardt admired the play and rehearsed it for a London production. After 2 weeks, the Lord Chancellor's office forbade it because it dealt with a biblical subject. Wilde was understandably infuriated and threatened to emigrate to France. Instead, he stayed And he wrote in the 3 years that followed, A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. In these plays, a contest is going on between the way people are expected to behave and the way they do. Most of the principal characters have secrets. Mrs. Erlyn cannot reveal who she is to her own daughter. Mrs. Arbuthnot has kept from her son the knowledge that she is really Miss Arbuthnot and not married. The ideal husband has long ago sold a state secret and is terrified of being found out. Algernon Moncrief has created a mythical friend named Bunbury, just as Jack has created a wicked brother. Stratagems to allow both to divide their lives into two and have, like Wilde, their escapades. Wilde was now the central figure in London. It was the age of Dorian.
I've just been here through Paris from the sunny southern shore. I do want to call a wind just to raise me with the rent. Dame Fortune smiled upon me as she never smiled before, and I've now got lots of money, I'm a gent. Yes, I've now got lots of rhino, I'm a gent. As I walk along the Bois de Boulogne with an independent air, you could hear the girls declare, he must be a millionaire. You could hear them sigh and wish that I could see them wink to the other eye as the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. As I walk along the Bois de Boulogne with an independent air, you could hear the girls declare, he must be a millionaire. You could hear them sigh and wish that I would see them wink to the other eye as the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo.
Wilde was affluent. He showed off, he disdained prudence, he delighted others, and he delighted himself. Beside him always was Bosie, as tempestuous as Cleopatra.
Bosie, you must not make scenes with me. They kill me. They wreck the loveliness of life. I cannot see you, so Greek and gracious, distorted with passion. I cannot listen to your curved lips saying hideous things to me. I would sooner be blackmailed by every renter in London than have you bitter, unjust, hating.
Wilde tried sporadically to break with Douglas, but whenever a rupture seemed imminent, Douglas, fearful of losing Wilde, redoubled his ardour, and they again converged. Their affair had become high romantic, no longer physical, since both preferred younger partners. It was Douglas who introduced Wilde to the young male prostitutes of Piccadilly. Wilde knew these young men were dangerous. He said being with them was like feasting with panthers. He nevertheless lavished gifts upon them, and so earned their ingratitude. His principal danger came not from them, but from Douglas's father. The Marquis of Queensberry had met Wilde in 1892 and found him charming. But by 1894, prompted by new rumours, he determined to rescue Douglas from Wilde. It was actually Wilde who needed rescuing from Douglas. The Marquis was passionate and choleric. He called on Wilde and demanded he stop seeing his son. Wilde defied him. Queensberry then tried to stage a demonstration at the importance of being earnest, but was barred by the police. He was not put off. 4 days later, he asked for Wilde at the Albemarle Club, and not finding him in, left a card with the hall porter. On the card he wrote, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite," and aristocratically misspelt the offensive word. When Wilde received the card from the porter, he saw his doom written on it. He wrote to a friend,
The Tower of Ivory is assailed by the foul thing. On the sand is my life spilt.
Goaded by Douglas, who hated his father, Wilde had a solicitor arrange for the arrest of Queensberry on a charge of criminal libel. It was, as Queensberry said, a booby trap. Wilde fell into it. Queensberry pleaded justification, and his barrister was the formidable Edward Carson, once Wilde's classmate at Trinity College, Dublin. On learning who his adversary was to be, Wilde remarked,
"No doubt he will perform the task with the added bitterness of an old friend."
So it proved. Carson began by an attempt to prove that Wilde's books were immoral. Wilde answered him brilliantly and held his own. Carson then narrowed in on a letter written by Wilde to Douglas.
Why should a man of your age address a boy nearly 20 years younger as my own boy?
Wilde insisted that the letter was a prose poem. But finally, Carson moved on to the series of male prostitutes whom Queensberry's private detectives had unearthed. One was Walter Granger.
Did you ever kiss him?
Wilde was momentarily off his guard and replied,
"Oh dear, no. He was a peculiarly plain boy. He was unfortunately extremely ugly. I pitied him for it."
Was that the reason why you did not kiss him?
For the first time, Wilde was flustered and Carson took full advantage. The questioning went on, but it was evident that the game had been lost. Wilde's counsel dropped the charge of libel against Queensberry and had to admit the defence of justification. The evidence pointed so strongly to Wilde's indecent relations with young men that his own prosecution was now inevitable. A few hours were left during which he might take the boat train to Paris. Wilde went to the Cadogan Hotel, where he was joined by Douglas and Robert Ross. They urged him to make off, but he hesitated, half-packed a suitcase, and chatted on, toying with departure, but unable to depart. The boat train left, the police officers arrived at his room, arrested him, and took him off to Bow Street. Wilde had many reasons for staying. He hated running away, and perhaps he had always suspected that such overweening success as his must necessarily be followed by unspeakable degradation. He had never refused to eat of any of the fruits of the garden, and now accepted the bitter as once the sweet. So ended the age of Dorian. Before Wilde's fall was complete, there were two trials. At the first, the jury could not agree. At the second, they found him guilty. The judge mercilessly sentenced him to 2 years at hard labor, a virtual death sentence at that time. Wilde was taken to the first of the 3 prisons in which he would serve his term. From being England's most prominent dramatist, he was its most prominent criminal. Overnight, he had become infamous.
We no longer speak of Mr. Oscar Wilde,
said Professor Mahaffey at Trinity. Prison conditions then were horrendous. Wilde lost his strength and was suspected of malingering. No special privileges were allowed him. Petitions for his release were unavailing. Nothing could soften his captors.
My first year in prison destroyed me, body and soul. It could not be otherwise.
The effect upon his family was also disastrous. His wife changed her name and that of her sons to Holland and left the country. She still loved and pitied her husband. When Lady Wilde died in 1896, Constance made a special trip from the continent to see him in prison and give him the dreadful news, knowing how keenly he would feel this death. Only in his third prison, Reading, did a change of governor make for gentler treatment. He was assigned lighter tasks and even allowed writing materials. What he wrote was a long pent-up letter to Bosie. It upbraided Douglas for causing his destruction. It also constituted a kind of apologia, as proud as it was humble, for his own life. His mother's death roused his sense of anguish.
Her death was so terrible to me that I, once a lord of language, have no words in which to express my anguish and my shame. She and my father had bequeathed me a name they had made noble and honored, not merely in literature, art, archaeology, and science, but in the public history of my own country in its evolution as a nation. I had disgraced that name eternally.
When Douglas received a copy of the letter, he tore it up, but it was published after Wilde's death under the title De Profundis. At last, on the 19th of May, 1897, Wilde was released. It was 6:15 in the morning. He greeted the friends who came to meet him, as one of them said, with the dignity of a king returning from exile. He then went over to France, where a second exile awaited him. At Dieppe, where he stayed briefly, he began to be snubbed and slighted by people who had once been proud to claim his friendship. He thought it best to move along the coast to a village called Berneval. There he held court at the Hôtel de la Plage for the faithful among his followers. As the weeks passed, the number of visitors diminished. He asked several people to companion him in exile. They could not or would not do so. Constance continued to put off reunion with her husband, and Wilde felt that he was unwelcome. The only person who did express a desire to live with him was Alfred Douglas. In spite of the recriminations addressed to Douglas in De Profundis, Wilde was still greatly attached to him.
My own darling boy, I got your telegram half an hour ago, and just send you a line to say that I feel that my only hope of again doing beautiful work in art is being with you. Everyone is furious with me for going back to you, but they don't understand us. Do remake my ruined life for me, and then our friendship and love will have a different meaning to the world.
He and Douglas met and took a villa at Posillipo, north of Naples. Not surprisingly, their life together was quarrelsome. Big spenders with little money, they scraped and scrabbled as friends and relatives tightened purse strings to force them to part. Wilde summarized Douglas's interests as boys, brandy, and betting. Both secretly welcomed the outside pressure to separate. They would never live together again.
I am occupied in finishing a poem, drawn from actual experience, a sort of denial of my own philosophy of art in many ways. I hope it is good, but every night I hear cocks crowing in Berneval, so I am afraid I may have denied myself, and would weep bitterly if I had not wept away all my tears.
At Berneval and Naples, Wilde developed an idea that he said had come to him while he was standing in the dock at his trial. He wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol in the months following his release.
The Ballad of Reading Gaol, Part 6. In Reading Gaol, by Reading Town, there is a pit of shame. In it lies a wretched man, eaten by feet of flame. In a burning, winding sheet he lies, and his grave got no name. And there, till Christ calls forth the dead, in silence let him lie. No need to wait for foolish care, or heed the windy sigh. The man had killed the thing he loved, and so he had to die.
And all men kill the thing they love. By all let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword.
A London publisher, Leonard Smithers, brought out the ballad as a book in 1898, giving as the author C33, which was Wilde's prison name. Everyone knew who it was, and in subsequent printings, Wilde's name was restored. The poem was a success, and the crescendo of hostility to Wilde began to change to regret. Wilde had only 3 years to live. Paris, once eager to share in his pomp and glory, afforded him now a meagre asylum. He settled eventually in the Hôtel d'Alsace, Rue des Beaux-Arts, where he was to die. He haunted the cafes and continued to rule the table with his epigrams and his stories. He did not change his habits.
A patriot put in prison for loving his country loves his country. A poet put in prison for loving boys loves boys.
Of course, there was always the possibility of writing a play.
I told you that I was going to write something. I tell everybody that. It is a thing one can repeat each day, meaning to do it the next. But in my heart, that chamber of leaden echoes, I know that I never shall.
In 1898, his wife, Constance, died under her assumed name of Constance Holland. No information about his children reached their father. Worst of all was that phantom procession of people he once knew who now passed him by as if he did not exist. Money, when he had it, slipped through his fingers.
Like dear St. Francis of Assisi, I am wedded to poverty. But in my case, the marriage is not a success. I hate the bride that has been given to me.
In 1900, an ear infection, which he attributed to a fall in prison, got worse and caused him intense pain. The operation that was performed proved useless. Whatever the disease, it was a mortal one. So long as he was conscious, Wilde continued to be the man he always was. The wallpaper in his room distressed him. "One of us had to go," he remarked. On hearing the doctors discuss their bills, he said, "I am dying as I have lived, beyond my means." On the 30th of November, 1900, Oscar Wilde died. The funeral carriage proceeded up the Rue des Seines to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, followed by a small band of the faithful. Oscar Wilde belonged to the modern world. He was a student of society and its peculiar ways, and wrote of them as no one else had. Now, beyond the reach of scandal, his art validated by time, he comes before us still, laughing and languid, with parables and paradoxes, the kindest and most amusing of men.